So our next speaker is Daimen Hardie, and Daimen knows trees. He is a co-founder of a not-for-profit called Community Forest International, which has done tree planting in islands off the coast of Tanzania, and has also purchased and is stewarding some lands in the Acadian forest in Nova Scotia. He knows all about carbon offsets, more than we'll ever be able to pick up in a talk this afternoon, but please welcome Daimen Hardie.
Thanks, Glenn, and thank you, everyone. I'm really excited to be here on the Bruce Peninsula. This is the second chance I've had to visit up here, and last time Glenn showed me some of the beautiful forests that you've got here. And so that'll be really the focus of my presentation, is sharing the forests that I work with on the East Coast. And you'll notice a lot of similarities with the forest types here. It's not the exact same, but it's a good mix of both softwood and deciduous trees like you've got up here. And our office is located in the Mi'kmaq district of Siksikawan, which is a borderlands between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. It's an isthmus, and it's basically it's what connects Nova Scotia to the rest of the continent. And I want to talk about the forests there and the communities that I work with, but before diving in, I want to share a little bit of the backstory of our organization and where we're coming from. So my friends and I actually started our organization together about, well, let's say 12 years ago now. Sorry, just trying to get this to work. And I might need some technical support. Okay. How's that? A little bit higher. Sorry. Oh, okay. Okay, well, I'll continue then until the slides start changing. I paid my way through university planting trees. Coming from rural New Brunswick, there weren't a whole lot of opportunities for work, so we actually would come up here to Northern Ontario or out west and plant trees. And in the off season, my really good friend Jeff, he didn't go to university, he would travel the world through the winters. And one year he ended up off the east coast of Tanzania in the Indian Ocean on this tiny island called Pemba, part of the Zanzibar archipelago. And he lived there for about 8 months and made some really excellent friends. And everybody would ask him, what do you do for a living? How does a young guy like you afford to, travel the world? And he would tell them, well, I'm a tree planter. And so they asked, well, maybe you can help us bring back some of the lost forests on these islands. And so Jeff came back to Canada for another season working with us all and was really excited about the potential. And it was something that had a lot of purpose behind it, which we were looking for as young idealistic folks. So we just started raising funds from our friends in these tree planting camps back here in Canada to send to friends over in Zanzibar to set up community nurseries to start growing trees and bringing back lost forests. And so that's really how it started. It was all volunteer for the first number of years. And when we saw the progress that we were having in East Africa, we decided we wanted to try to make some change closer to home as well and work with the really beautiful forests here in Canada to see if we could, protect and restore forests here, which have just such a huge role to play in stabilizing the climate. We're still working on it. I really want it to work because I brought some beautiful photos of the landscapes and people that I work with, and it's also my cue to help me stay on point. Okay, we're going to try to fix it, because it really might be easier. All right. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Russ. Thank you. Okay, while he's getting that set back up, so a lot of the work that I want to talk about that we do here in Canada really has been inspired by the start that we had in Zanzibar. And you know, one of the things we learned from colleagues there was that most of the pressures that we see on the natural world, on forests, come from, you know, pressures on people. And when people are struggling with poverty maybe, and they're trying to take care of their family, they're forced to put harvesting pressures on forests. And that's really the root of a lot of the problems. So what we ended up trying to do is find ways that people can make a living while working on the land, while working with forests, in a way that was regenerative, in a way that they could make a living from the forest without destroying it in the process. That was really the main lesson that we took from our colleagues in Zanzibar, and that's what we've brought back here. And so Glenn, he mentioned our work with forest carbon offsets. We built one of the first forest carbon projects in Canada to save some really special endangered forest on the East Coast. We working here now? Yeah, great, okay. Starting to anyways. Well, I'll try to catch up here. So you'll get a quick little glimpse of some of our work in Zanzibar, learning from the pros. Okay, a couple more really quick points on Zanzibar and I'll bring it back here. These tiny islands in the Indian Ocean are surrounded by mangrove forests. Anyone who's familiar, mangrove forests are really unique. They grow half in the ocean, half on land. They're almost like a bioshield. They protect coastal communities from sea level rise. They support a huge diversity of life. They're also one of the most carbon-dense forest ecosystems in the world. And so a lot of our work is about protecting and restoring these mangrove forests. The biggest pressure on mangrove forests is poverty and people having to go into them to cut to make charcoal, to cook their food, or to sell, to earn a bit of money. So we see a lot of overcutting in mangrove forests, and then that exposes coastal communities to greater climate risks. Things like saltwater intrusion as the sea level rises. Without that natural buffer, you've got salt water infiltrating people's wells. You've got it infiltrating low-lying agricultural lands. And these are some of the biggest climate impacts that we see in the region, and protecting and restoring these natural forests can actually help slow those impacts. But what do you do? How do you provide people with an alternative to cutting those mangrove forests? So what we do is we look at the terrestrial lands that are largely degraded in these tiny islands. The natural forest has all been cut down, and most people rely on agriculture for their daily sustenance. But what we help people do is convert degraded agricultural land into these agroforests. So these tree-based systems that function more like a natural forest and continue to produce crops for people, so they can have some food security, they can earn income, but actually provides some habitat as well and some ecosystem services. So this is actually, this was a cornfield not more than 8 years ago when we started working with Hamad, and that's actually a farm that you're looking at, but it looks and functions like a forest. So these are some of the things that really inspire our work back in Canada. It's people working with the land, making a living on the land, but restoring it in the process, and generating benefit not only for themselves, but also for their community and for the diversity of life that lives there, and of course bringing greater climate security to the region as well. So that's another example. That's Bimajo. That's what she's got growing there beside her is some vanilla. So vanilla is an orchid, a vine. It's a very lucrative crop. It takes a few years to produce, and you need a forest canopy. You need a forest environment really for vanilla to thrive. And so this was also a cassava field, so an annual crop field that was drought prone, that she slowly restored into a forest-like setting, mainly so she could grow vanilla and earn good money growing vanilla. So you can see how it starts a flywheel of restoration when you help people make a living by protecting and restoring the land. I'm still struggling with this. Okay, so back to the east coast of Canada. This is the first forest that we ever conserved as an organization. It's in this beautiful hidden valley in southeast New Brunswick. And when we were seeing all that really inspiring work in Zanzibar and wanting to replicate it here closer to home, we started looking around for mentors and people who reflected that same ability to make a living from the land while restoring it or protecting it in the process. And in our search, we talked to lots of different mentors, lots of different really interesting people, and we eventually met these two, Clark and Susan, an elderly couple who owned the 1,000 acres of forest in this beautiful valley. They were leaders in the organic farming movement in Canada, so they actually helped to develop some of the standards, and they really practiced the same ethic of care in the forest as well. So they ended up being these really great leaders in a more restorative approach to forestry. So they took us under their wing. They taught us so much. They were at an age where they needed to retire. And because they had made a lot of, I guess I would say, sacrifices in living a more principled life and treating the land sustainably, they were not rich when they needed to retire. And all of their equity, all of their savings really was in that forest. And so they couldn't just give us the forest. We needed to figure out how to buy it from them at a fair price. And so as a small, local nonprofit, we did the bake sale. We tried everything, to raise enough money. We couldn't quite do it, and unfortunately Clark and Sue were starting to sell off pieces of the forest, and it was immediately getting clear cut. So you can see this is the area around Welgenbrand Forest, and you can see that's the business as usual, really, is a high rates of clear cutting. And that's what created our first forest carbon project. So we connected with a sustainable architecture and engineering firm that happened to be trying to demonstrate climate leadership. They'd already done everything they could to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. We were left with a residual amount of emissions that they were trying to take responsibility for. And so they contacted us, and we valued the carbon that was stored in that forest. And we looked at the risk that forest faced, the business as usual that was going to occur if we didn't intervene. And we were able to quantify what the climate benefit would be for that. And they paid us for that, which is what financed the conservation of that forest. And so ever since that one forest that we protected, we've been trying to expand that opportunity to the wider region, because we understand although saving one special forest is really important, it's not going to get the globally significant changes that we need. And so some of the stats that you're seeing up there just refer to how little of this special forest type still exists in the world. And so I just want to take a second to talk a little bit about it, and then I've got just a short little video clip to play so you can hear some other voices and see for yourself what this forest is like. So the Wabanagi forest, or the Acadian forest, it grows basically from New York State up through all the maritime provinces and then up into the Gaspé Peninsula. And what makes it so unique is that it's the only place on the continent where you get a blending of boreal forest species and the hardwood forest to our south. And the range of the Wabanagi forest basically is also the range of the red spruce tree, which doesn't grow anywhere else. So basically wherever red spruce grows, that's the range of the Wabanagi forest. And the reason it's called the Wabanagi forest is because it's also the range of the 5 original nations of that land. Mi'kmaq, Wustakwe, Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, and Abenaki nations form the Wabanagi Confederacy, and their territory, happen to basically share the exact same territory of this very diverse forest. So it's one of the most diverse temperate forests in the world. Today it's largely privately owned, which means we work with a lot of individual landowners to help them practice more climate-focused management on their lands. And we've had some pretty big breakthroughs recently where we've been able to enroll over 65,000 acres of individual family forests into shared management for climate and ecological outcomes, and those families are receiving economic rewards so that they can move away from the clear cutting, which is so predominant, and more towards more restorative approaches that also stores a significant amount of carbon. Okay, so I think the next one is just to show a little clip from some of my colleagues and hear some other voices from our work, and to give you a sense of what this forest really looks like. And again, you'll see a lot of similarities to the forests here in the Bruce Peninsula.
We are here today in Cambridge Narrows, which is a beautiful community, and it's in the Canaan-Washtemowick watershed system, which is part of the greater Wolastoq-St. John River watershed system. And just up the road is one of our fabulous conservation properties called Robinson Conservation Forest.
Lay me down beneath the pale blue sky, falling still amongst the golden pine.
We first heard about Robinson Forest through the environmental network that exists in New Brunswick, and we were connected to the previous owner, Robina Weatherly, née Robinson.
My great-great-grandfather and his bride came here in 1802 in June, and were on this land then. I spent quite a bit of time in the woods as a child. It was my favorite thing to do. Wandered the fields and the woods, and that was my playground. And my father always cut a little bit of lumber in the winter. He very selectively managed his forest before anybody knew that that's what you called it.
We found a kindred spirit in Robina who didn't have really a strong succession plan for her forest. And we came to a really happy agreement for the two parties that involved us purchasing it as part of our forest carbon offsets work. And so we've been successful in protecting that forest by selling the forest carbon offsets from that property.
They were the first people who'd ever approached me with ideas of wanting the forest for values other than cutting it down. And that appealed to me.
The other reason that that property is so special is it's had a long history of really careful stewardship. For thousands of years, the Wolastoqey people of this region had in their care this property and many others.
So yeah, this land was so bountiful and rich and diverse, and we managed it on a broad scale, you know what I mean, from lower Maine all the way up into Quebec. In places we got hazelnuts and beech nuts and butternuts, and we didn't take butternuts and make farms out of them, but where the butternuts grew, we would make it better for the butternuts.
Robinson Conservation Forest is really special for a couple of reasons. It contains some old forest in the order of a couple or more 100 years.
Where you've got the hemlock and the oak, these indicator trees that are like, at one point that was 40 to 50% of this.
And those species are much less common on the landscape than they once were due to decades of intensive harvesting. So any of those old hemlock and white pine forests that did exist in this province are mostly all gone and replaced with younger softwood plantations.
And plantations, I don't think, are a forest. I mean, this is a total ecosystem.
And I would be happy to respond to any questions about the forest carbon and the offsetting mechanisms and everything else. I know we're a little bit behind on time, so I'll try to move maybe a little quickly through the next few slides here. Yeah, so one thing I do want to note when I talk about forest carbon is, one thing we have to really avoid is obviously distilling down the value of the natural world down to these like single elements. It's one of, a diversity of values. And I know some of this work was already covered really well this morning. And for folks who are interested in learning more, there's more and more resources all the time. World Wildlife Fund has done some pretty good work mapping the carbon density of different ecosystems across Canada and helping, inform prioritization when it comes to these natural carbon sinks. But yeah, the main point though that I wanted to make, so our organization is leading a lot of that work, but we also recognize that the carbon storage is just one value. And one thing that we see so often is the combination of the global climate change mitigation values that forests provide and the local climate change adaptation values. So this is a map of that conservation forest that was just featured in the video, which we've actually since expanded. And the flood map of that region. And we've done some other work to quantify and to give a value to the flood mitigation and flood attenuation, services that keeping that natural forest intact provides to the adjacent communities. So we basically figured out, well, how much timber value would you generate if you cut that forest down? And then what would you have to build in the way of built infrastructure in the way of catchment ponds to then store the amount of and rainwater during a storm event? And of course you'd have to spend over $1 million, 4 times the value of the lumber, if you wanted to replace that local climate adaptation value that the forest is naturally providing. And so I think the valuation of these ecosystem services is really important. It can, I think, open eyes and change policy, but the other thing I would just always caution is to never forget the intrinsic value that these forests hold as well, which is always actually probably in greater proportion. So another thing is that people are probably acutely aware of is working with living systems like forest to store carbon and slow climate change according to the UN scientists, could provide up to 1/3 of the carbon storage and sequestration and emission reductions that we need this decade. They're also living systems themselves, and they are experiencing the adverse impacts of climate change. So when you work with forests as carbon sinks, you also need to think about how you're keeping that forest healthy and resilient, because it's a living thing itself. And that's a whole other dimension. And I think Ethan talked about, ecological resilience. These are ways that we can help our ecosystems thrive so that they can help keep us safe. And I want to show just another even shorter clip hearing from some of the scientists and colleagues in the region who work on that adaptation aspect. And I believe we have some Francophone colleagues. There's some subtitles, and I can maybe do a little bit of translating afterwards.
This old maritime saying, if you don't like the weather, wait a minute and it'll change. I am seeing, and the old people are seeing, a shift in that, where we get these weather locks. So it'll go from hothouse for weeks, and then somebody will turn the switch and it suddenly feels like October in the middle of August. Just allowing this climate change thing and its impacts on the forest just to run its course without human intervention is irresponsible. And I certainly believe that we owe it to future generations to try and minimize the negative impacts on the things that we value from the forest.
Si je pouvais communiquer quelque chose aux propriétaires de boisés, je leur dirais qu'ils sont extrêmement privilégiés d'être dans cette région-là du monde, parce que c'est probablement une des régions qui a les meilleurs outils pour s'adapter au changement climatique. C'est-à-dire que c'est une région où le climat est relativement tempéré. C'est une région qui reçoit beaucoup de pluie, beaucoup plus que dans l'ouest. Puis troisièmement, il y a une grande diversité d'espèces d'arbres ici. C'est pas comme la forêt boréale où on peut retrouver une seule espèce sur des kilomètres et des kilomètres. Ici, on a des dizaines et des dizaines d'espèces d'arbres. Donc là-dedans, on a un éventail de possibilités d'essences qui seront mieux adaptées.
The stands or the forests that are going to be most resilient to climate change, stand diversity is a big factor. The more diverse that your stand is, the more likely it is to be resilient and fare better under climate change.
So here in the Maritimes, our forest is characterized as the Acadian forest. It's a unique forest region composed of a specific mixture of tree species that you don't find anywhere else on the continent. The climate here is generally moist. It's heavily influenced by the ocean.
Historically, we enjoyed, at a regional level, a fairly moderated growing season with fairly evenly distributed precipitation. We are now having repeated, prolonged periods of drought.
Alors, ce que les projections climatiques anticipent dans les prochaines décennies, c'est un climat qui va être 3, 4, peut-être 5 degrés au-dessus des normales historiques. En général, les gens peuvent se dire que c'est une bonne chose parce que les hivers sont longs au Nouveau-Brunswick, mais la réalité, c'est que les extrêmes vont être plus extrêmes. On parle l'été de 2, 3, 4 degrés d'augmentation des températures, mais l'hiver, ça peut monter à 6, 7, 8 degrés d'augmentation des températures. Il y a aussi un important aspect, c'est les précipitations. On anticipe une légère hausse des précipitations. Mais par contre, il faut bien comprendre, c'est que cette hausse des précipitations ne compensera pas pour l'augmentation des températures. On parle aussi de tempêtes plus extrêmes, d'événements en général plus extrêmes et plus intenses.
To summarize any of that, for anyone who didn't catch it, they were talking about how the diversity of...
We are here today in Cambridge Narrows, which is a beautiful community, and it's in the Canaan-Washtemoick watershed system, which is part of the greater...
The more ability that you have in that ecosystem to respond to any change that might come. And what we've seen recently on the East Coast is the greater frequency and intensity of storms. So for anyone who's been following recently, we were hit, but just in the last few weeks, we were hit by Hurricane Fiona. And it's something that people have researched going back, thousands of years to understand how frequently are these storms naturally occurring in the Wabanagi Forest region. I think we've got some more slides there, if you could, Russ. And so it's naturally, wind disturbance is something that happens in the forest, but stand replacing events, so big winds that blow down all the trees in a forest, usually only happens once every 1,000 years or more. And we had it happen just a few weeks ago. We had it happen in 2019 with Hurricane Dorian. We had it happen in 2003 with Hurricane Juan. So the frequency and intensity of these hurricanes hitting the eastern seaboard is definitely increasing. At the same time, unfortunately, some of the stats I showed earlier, the natural resilience of the forest has been diminished because of the intense harvesting over the last few hundred years. And so the forest architecture is more vulnerable. It's more simplified. We don't have the diversity, the natural diversity. So at the same time that we're seeing this increased climate impacts, we've also got diminished natural infrastructure, diminished resilience in the forest, and people and communities and ecosystems are suffering from that. And so these are the trends that we need to really reverse. So yeah, here's some photos of the recent damages, and I'll probably go through quickly here because I know we're running out of time. But there's I guess an illustrative one. If you can tell, those are all trees that were blown down in the last few weeks, and that was forest that had been managed specifically to create these conditions. So it was clear cut. It was clear cut, and it was then replanted with softwood trees only. Then it was sprayed with herbicides to kill all the hardwoods. And then as those softwood trees grew up, about 15 years later, people went in and thinned them out to encourage the growth of those softwood trees, and just created the perfect conditions for being blown down by a hurricane. There's a lot of research that shows when there's more of a mix between hardwood and softwood species in the forest, it's more wind firm, in addition to providing more habitat for diversity of life and storing more carbon and all the rest. And you can see in the top of the photo there, that's an area where more of the trees were left. There's hardwood trees with the leaves off, so they're hard to see, but those areas stood firmly through the windstorm. Go to the next one there. Yeah, there's an illustrative photo. I mean, that's not doctored or anything. On the right is one of our old conservation forests, and on the left is a forest that's the property line right there that was clear cut about 50 years ago. And yeah, I mean, you can see it. You don't need to be an expert to recognize how on the left you've just got less ecological vibrancy. You've also got less habitat, and it's just like night and day. All right, next one. And so here's a picture of one of the old forests we've conserved recently. There's so little left. The last research indicated that less than 5% of the Wabanagi forest remained in a pre-colonial condition, and it's probably actually a lot less than that. So one of the things we're doing right now is going around the region, trying to find these last remnants and then conserve them, and not just for the climate values, but also because they're really refugia for the biological diversity that we need to restore to the wider landscape. So this is something we're doing right now. In addition to the carbon work, we've protected 9 of these last old forests just this year. We've got 3 more in process, and we've got a lot of really excellent support for this work that we've been honestly floored by. So we've got a lot of momentum for it and want to do more in the coming years that I'm really excited about. All right, next slide. Yeah, so I'll just end with a few photos of our team and some of these really old forests that we've been able to find and protect over the last few months. And I guess the last thought is if you want to learn more, please visit our website or come up to me after the talk. And I've been so inspired by all the talks that I've heard here today. I've seen like so many themes, and one of the themes that has really resonated with me is the intergenerational nature of the response to the climate crisis. And working with forests, I see that a lot because trees naturally grow for hundreds and hundreds of years, and you can't really properly work with a forest without recognizing that your own personal lifetime is pretty short in comparison. You need to be thinking of the next generation and the generation after. And a lot of our mentors, have been really good to us in that they've left us these beautiful forests that we can now care for and hand on. And if they hadn't have been protectors of those forests, we wouldn't even know what we were missing. We wouldn't know what the full potential of these ecosystems are. And we have people waking up to how urgently we need to bring that full potential back to the landscape. Again, not just to store a globally significant amount of carbon and slow the climate crisis, but to take care of the diversity of life that those forests hold, and increasingly to provide resilience to the adjacent communities that are going to be experiencing the impacts of climate change that we're already locked into in the coming years. And forests can be one of the best protectors for communities in that way. All right, thank you. Yeah, thanks for bearing with me trying to figure out how to use the technology too. I appreciate that. Okay, yeah.
Thanks. Very inspiring work. Congratulations. Thanks for your leadership and making Canada proud and doing what you're doing. There are a number of us working on the peninsula here, led with the conservation initiative in the Bruce Trail Conservancy, and there's an opportunity for planting a new forest in a large field. Do you have any advice on minimum size worth doing? I'm sure you're going to say what do, but is there a sort of a size for vibrancy of starting from scratch to introduce the traditional species and the 3 layers of the forest and really have something that could be a good start and a good demonstration? Is there a minimum size?
Yeah, excellent question. I think you're right. You've already got it. It's like we need to do absolutely everything everywhere. Every little pocket is going to help. And one thing I didn't really speak too much about is how much restoration is also needed. So protecting and conserving the last of the old intact ecosystems is absolutely #1 top priority. Those are the ecosystems that hold the most life. They're also the ones that hold the most carbon. But then the reality is the rest of the landscape is degraded in some way or another. And to bring these ecosystems to their full potential, we need to be practicing that restoration. And I think that restoration, there's a lot of jobs that can be created in that. There's a lot of deep technical development that can go into that. So I haven't seen like a minimum viable size for restoration. What I will say is that accelerating restoration is a challenge. It can be done, but starting from an old field and moving to a forest is challenging, especially in this climate. So yeah, if you can be a bit patient and see where natural succession can kind of guide the way, that's been our experience. So maybe putting more effort on fewer trees, but really protecting those trees properly and caring for them so that they survive, because getting good survival in those afforestation projects can be tough. But thinking long term, if you grow a few of those trees up, like an oak, to the point where it's now dropping acorns, and you've got jays and squirrels spreading those acorns across the landscape, then you've got nature working for you, with you, I should say. So my advice would be nothing's too small, and maybe with starting from a field, put a lot of effort into growing a handful of trees, getting them to survive and thrive, and then letting them start dropping seed into the ecosystem and taking that flywheel forward. Yeah.
Thank you. Very interesting and important work. I've also done some forest carbon modeling in all the national park forests. And when you look at it, some years we are a major sink, lots of carbon sequestration, but there are years when you look at the net carbon budget, we're a major source. So we exceed how much carbon we're sequestering, and that through wildfire, forest insect disease, decomposition, those sorts of things. So I'm wondering how you approach you're dealing with carbon offsets and how you approach that sort of shadow that, you know, these forests can be disturbed, they can be burned, they can be, you know, cause decomposition. How do you approach that sort of with your community to own that as well, to say these could also be a carbon source?
And for anyone who's not aware, Canada's forests are a net, managed forests in particular, are a net source of greenhouse gas emissions. So unfortunately our forests are making climate change worse right now. They emit more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere nationally than they absorb. And that's not what the industry will tell you, but that's the reality. And even according to the government's own data, that's what's happening. And part of that absolutely is the increased intensity and frequency of climate disasters. Those are human caused, I feel. We have to take responsibility for the increased wildfires because we're creating the conditions that's causing that. Also, it's about over-harvesting. We've taken too much. I think a lot of the presentations today have really like reinforced that. But I want to come back to my main point, which is that these are living systems. We need to work with them in an adaptive way. And if we expect them to provide these ecological services, we also have to care for them very actively. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there in people having to play a more active role in helping ecosystems adapt and be restored. Just on the point of carbon cycles, you know, nothing's permanent, basically. But these ecosystems can be perpetual. That's what I like to think of it as. If you perpetually care for them, they can perpetually store carbon and support a diversity of life. But it's not like a set it and forget it scenario by any means. And as we've seen, as the intensity of the climate impacts increases, we increasingly have to respond in how we care for ecosystems as well. So it's it's a hard tension to bridge for sure. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Daimen. We have our John Terpstra Book of Poetry, autographed by the poet himself. One thing I'm struck by is how similar the Wabanaki forest is to us, and I'm not sure why that map you had ends at the Adirondacks, because our forest is incredibly similar to what I see in the Acadian forest. Few differences in species, but it's very similar. It's got similar diversity, which means it's darned important. And it's resilient, and we need to make sure it stays that way. Thanks again, Daimen.